Chapter 61. Since they were Africans, neither man showed how much this moment had been awaited by both of them. The older man offered Kunta his only chair, but when he saw that his guest preferred to squat on the dirt floor as he would have done in a village back home, the kwa-kwa player grunted with satisfaction, lighted the candle on his leaning table, and squatted down himself. "I comes from Ghana, and mine is the Akan peoples. The white folks give me the name Pompey, but my real one's Boteng Badiako. I's been a long time here, 6 white folks' plantations, and I hopes this the last one. How about you?" Trying to copy the Ghanaian's terse way of speaking, Kunta told him of the Gambia, of Jafur, of being Mandinka, of his family, of his capture and escapes, his foot, doing gardening, and now driving the buggy. The Ghanaian listened intently, and when Kunta finished, the Ghanaian sat thinking a while before he spoke again. "We's all sufferin'. A man wise, he try to learn from it." He paused and looked appraisingly at Kunta. "How old you is?" Kunta said 37 reins. "You ain't look it. I's 66. "You ain't look dat either," said Kunta. "Well, I's been here longer'n you been born. Wishes back then I coulda knowed somethin' dat I's learned now, but you still young, so I tell it to you. Old grandmamas in you country, they tell youngins the stories?" Kunta said that they did. "Then I tell you one. It's 'bout growin' up here. It's 'bout growin' up where I come from. I members how the chief of our Akan peoples used to set in this big chair made out of elephant's teeth, and it was a man always held an umbrella over his head. Then longside was the man the chief spoke through. Only way he ever talked, or anybody could talk to him, was through this man. And then a boy sat at the chief's feet. This boy stood for the chief's soul, and he run the chief's messages to the people. This boy run with a thick-bladed sword, so whoever seed him comin' knowed exactly who he was. I growed up bein' that boy, runnin' messages 'mongst the peoples. That's how the white men's cotched me." Kunta was about to speak when the Ghanaian held up his hand. "That ain't the end of the story. What I's gettin' to, on top of the chief's umbrella was this carvin' of a hand holdin' a egg. That stood for the care a chief used his powers with. And that man the chief talked through, he always held a staff. And on that staff a turtle was carved. Turtle stood for that the key to livin' is patience." The Ghanaian paused. "And it was a bee carved on the shell of that turtle. B stood for that nothin' can't sting through the turtle's hard shell." In the flickering candlelight of the hut, the Ghanaian paused. "This is what I wants to pass on to you, that I's learned in the white folks' land. What you needs most to live here is patience with a hard shell." In Africa, Kunta was sure this man would have been a Kintango or an Alcala, if not a chief himself, but he didn't know how to say what he felt, and just sat there without saying anything. "Look like you got both," said the Ghanaian finally with a smile. Kunta began to stammer an apology, but his tongue still seemed to be tied. The Ghanaian smiled again, fell silent for a moment himself, then spoke again. "You Mandinkas spoke of in my country as great travelers and traders." He left the statement in midair, clearly waiting for Kunta to say something. At last Kunta found his voice. "You heard right. My uncles is travelers. Listenin' to stories they used to tell, seemed like they been just 'bout everywhere. Me and my father once, we went to a new village they done started a long ways from Jafur. I was plannin' to go to Mecca and Timbuktu and Mali, and all like they done, but I got stole 'fore I had the chance." "I know some 'bout Africa," said the Ghanaian. the chief had me teached by the wise men. I ain't forgot what they said, and I's tried to put it together with things I heard and seed since I been here, and I knows that most of us that's brought here is stole from West Africa, from up round your Gambia all the way down the coast to my Guinea. Is you heard of what white folks calls the Gold Coast? Kunta said that he hadn't. They named it that count of the gold there. That coast go clear up to the Volta. It's that coast where the white folks, Kachas, the Fanti, and the Ashanti peoples. It's them Ashantis that's said to lead most of the uprisings and revolts when they's brought here. Spite that, the white folks pays some of they biggest prices for them, 'cause they's smart and strong and they's got spirit. Then what they calls the slave coast is where they gets the Yorubas and the Homans, and round the tip of Niger they gets the Igbo. Kunta said that he had heard the Igbo were a gentle people. The Ghanaian nodded. I's heard of 30 Igbos joined hands and walked into a river, all singing and drowned together. That was in Louisiana. Kunta was starting to get worried that the massa might be ready to leave and he might keep him waiting, and a moment of silence passed between them. As Kunta's mind cast about for some topic appropriate to leave on, the Ghanaian said, "Sho ain't nobody here to set and talk with like us is. Heap o' times Kwa got to say what I got on my mind. Reckon maybe I was talking to you without knowing you was there." Deeply moved, Kunta looked the Ghanaian in the eye for a long moment, and then they both got up. In the candlelight, Kunta noticed on the table the forgotten 2 sandwiches that Liza had given him. He pointed to them and smiled. "We can eat any time. Now I knows you gotta go," said the Ghanaian. "In my country, whilst we was talking, I'd have been carving something out of a thorn to give you." Kunta said that in the Gambia he would have been carving something from a large dried mango seed. "Whole heap of times I done wished I had a mango seed to plant and grow up to remind me o' home," he said. The Ghanaian looked solemnly at Kunta, then he smiled. "You's young. Seeds you got a plenty. You just needs the wife to plant 'em in." Kunta was so embarrassed that he didn't know how to reply. The Ghanaian thrust out his left arm, and they shook their left hands in the African manner, meaning that they would soon meet again. "As-salakium salam, malaika salam," and Kunta crept hurriedly out into the deepening dusk, past the other small huts, and up toward the big house, wondering if the massa had already come out looking for him. But it was another half-hour before the massa appeared, and as Kunta drove the buggy homeward, scarcely feeling the reins in his hands or hearing the horse's hooves on the road, he felt as if he had been talking with his dear father Amaro. No evening of his life had ever meant more to him. Chapter 62. Seen Toby passing yesterday. Hollered at him, "Hey, drop by and set a while." "You oughta seen the look he give me. Ain't even spoke." "What you reckon it is?" the fiddler asked the gardener. The gardener had no idea, and they both asked Belle. "Can't tell. If he's sick or something, he oughta say so. I'm just leaving him alone. He actin' so funny," she declared. Even Massa Waller noticed that his commendably reserved and reliable driver seemed not to be his usual self. He hoped it wasn't an incubating stage of a current local contagion to which they both had been exposed, so one day he asked Kunta if he felt badly. "Nah, sir," Kunta quickly replied, so Massa Waller put forth concern out of his mind, so long as his driver got him where he was going. Kunta had been rocked to the core by his encounter with the Ghanaian, and that very fact made it clear to him how lost he had become. Day by day, year by year, he had become less resisting, more accepting, until finally, without even realizing it, he had forgotten who he was. It was true. It was true that he had come to know better and learned to get along with the fiddler, the gardener, Belle, and the other blacks. But he knew now that he could never really be one of them, any more than they could be like him. Alongside the Ghanaian, in fact, the fiddler and the gardener and Belle now seemed to Kunta only irritating. He was glad that they were keeping their distance. Lying on his pallet at night, he was torn with guilt and shame about what he had let happen to himself. He had still been an African when he used to awaken suddenly here in his cabin, jerking upright, shocked to discover that he wasn't in Jafur. But the last time that happened had been many years ago. He had still been an African when his memories of the Gambia and its people had been the only thing that sustained him. But months might pass now without his having a single thought about Jafur. He had still been an African back in those early years, when each new outrage had sent him onto his knees, imploring Allah to give him strength and understanding. How long had it been since he had even properly prayed to Allah? His learning to speak the Tubab tongue, he realized, had played a big part in it. In this everyday talking, he seldom even thought of Mandinka words anymore, excepting those few that for some reason his mind still clung to. Indeed, by now, Kunta grimly faced it. He even thought in the Tubab tongue. In countless things he did as well as said and thought, his Mandinka ways had slowly been replaced by those of the blacks he had been among. The only thing in which he felt he could take some small pride was that in 20 reigns he had never touched the meat of the swine. Kunta searched his mind. There must have been something else of his original self that he could find someplace, and there was. He had kept his dignity. Through everything, he had worn his dignity as once in Jafur he had worn his Safi charms to keep away the evil spirits. He vowed to himself that now more than ever his dignity must become as a shield between him and all of those who called themselves. How ignorant of themselves they were! They knew nothing of their ancestors, as he had been taught from boyhood. Kunta reviewed in his mind the names of the Kintis from the ancient clan in Old Mali down across the generations in Mauritania, then in the Gambia all the way to his brothers and himself, and he thought of how the same ancestral knowledge was possessed by every member of his kafo. It set Kunta to reminiscing about those boyhood friends. At first he was only surprised, but then he grew shocked when he found that he couldn't remember their names. Their faces came back to him, along with memories of them racing out beyond the village gate like blackbirds to serve as chattering escorts in Jafur for every traveler who passed by, hurling sticks at the scolding monkeys overhead, who promptly hurled them back, of contests they'd held to see who could eat 6 mangoes the fastest. But try as Kunta might, he couldn't recall their names, not one of them. He could see his kafo gathered, frowning at him. In his hut, and driving the massa, Kunta racked his brain. And finally the names did begin to come, one by one. Yes, Sitafasila, he and Kunta had been best friends, and Kalilu Kante, he had stalked and caught the parrot at the Kintango's command. Sifokila, he had asked the Council of Elders for permission to have a Turia sexual friendship with that widow. The faces of some of the elders began to come back now, and with them the names he thought he had long since forgotten. The Kintango was Sila Badiba, the Alimama was Kujali Demba, the Wadanila was Karamo Tamba. Kunta remembered his third Kafo graduating ceremony, where he had read his Quranic verses so well that Omoro and Binta gave a fat goat to the Arafang, whose name was Brima Sise. Remembering them all filled Kunta with joy, until it occurred to him that those elders would have died by now, and his Kafo mates, whom he remembered as little boys, would be his age back in Jafur, and he would never see them again. For the first time in many years, he cried himself to sleep. In the county seat a few days later, another buggy driver told Kunta that some free blacks up north, who called themselves the Union, had proposed a mass return to Africa of all blacks, both free and slaves. The very thought of it excited Kunta, even as he scoffed that it couldn't ever happen, with masses not only competing to buy blacks, but also paying higher prices than ever. Though he knew the fiddler would almost rather stay a slave in Virginia than go to Africa a free man, Kunta wished he could discuss it with him. For the fiddler always seemed to know all there was to know about what was going on anywhere if it had anything to do with freedom. But for almost 2 months now, Kunta hadn't done more than scowl at the fiddler or at Belle, and the gardener either. Not that he needed them or even liked them that much, of course, but the feeling of being stranded kept growing within him. By the time the next new moon rose, and he miserably dropped another pebble into his gourd, he was feeling inexpressibly lonely, as if he had cut himself off from the world. The next time Kunta saw the fiddler pass by, he nodded at him uncertainly, but the fiddler kept walking as if he hadn't even seen anyone. Kunta was furiously embarrassed. The very next day, he and the old gardener saw each other at the same moment, and without missing a step, the gardener turned in another direction. Both hurt and bitter, and with a mounting sense of guilt, Kunta paced back and forth in his hut for more hours that night. The next morning, bracing himself, he crept outside and down Slave Road to the door of the once familiar last hut. He knocked. The door opened. "What do you want?" the fiddler asked coldly. Swallowing with embarrassment, Kunta said, "Just figured I'd come by." The fiddler spat on the ground. "Look here. Now hear what I tells you. Me and Belle and the old man been scussin' you. And we all agrees, if it's anything we can't stand, it's a sometimey." He glared at Kunta. "That's all been wrong wid you. You ain't sick or nothin'." Kunta stood looking at his shoes. After a moment, the fiddler's glare softened, and he stepped aside. "Since you's already here, come on in. But I'm going to tell you, show yo' ass one more time, and you won't get spoke to again till you's ol' as Methuselah." Choking down his rage and humiliation, Kunta went on inside and sat down, and after a seemingly endless silence between them, which the fiddler obviously had no intention of ending, Kunta forced himself to tell about the Back to Africa proposal. The fiddler said coolly that he had long known about that, and that there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell that it would ever happen. Seeing Kunta's hurt expression, the fiddler seemed to relent a little. "Let me tell you something I bets you ain't heard. Up north in New York, dey's what you call a manumission society that done open a school for free what wants to get learned readin' and writin' and all kinds of trades." Kunta was so happy and relieved to have the fiddler talking to him again that he hardly heard what his old friend was saying to him. A few minutes later, the fiddler stopped talking for a moment and sat looking at Kunta inquiringly. "Is I keepin' you up?" he asked finally. Said Kunta, who had been lost in thought. "I asked you a question about 5 minutes ago. Sorry, I was thinking about something. Well, since you don't know how to listen, I show you how it's done." He sat back and crossed his arms. "Ain't you gonna go on with what you was sayin'?" asked Kunta. By now I forgets what I was saying. Is you forget what you was thinking? It ain't important. Just something been on my mind. Better you get it off there 'fore you gets a headache. Or gives me one. I can't 'scuss it. Huh, said the fiddler, acting insulted. If in dat the way you feel, ain't you, it's just too personal. A light began to dawn in the fiddler's eye. Don't tell me, it's 'bout a woman, right? Ain't nothin' of the kind, said Quinta, flushing with embarrassment. He sat speechless for a moment, then got up and said, Well, I be late for work, so I see you later. Thanks for talking with me. Sure thing, just let me know when you wants to do some talking. How had he known? Quinta asked himself on his way to the stable. And why had he insisted on making him talk about it? It was only with the greatest reluctance that Quinta had even let himself think about it. But lately he could hardly seem to think about anything else. It had to do with the Ghanaian's advice about planting his seeds. Chapter 63. Long before he met the Ghanaian, Quinta had often had a hollow feeling whenever he thought about the fact that if he had been in Jafur, he would have had 3 or 4 sons by now, along with the wife who had given birth to them. What usually occasioned these thoughts was when about once each moon, Quinta had a dream from which he always awakened abruptly in the darkness, acutely embarrassed at the hot stickiness that had just burst from his still rigid photo. Lying awake afterward, he thought not so much of a wife as he did about how he knew that there was hardly a slave row where some man and woman who cared for one another had not simply begun living together in whichever's hut was the better one. There were many reasons why Quinta didn't want to think about getting married. For one thing, it seemed to involve the couple's jump into broomstick before witnesses from Slave Row, which seemed ridiculous to Quinta for such a solemn occasion. In a few cases he had heard of, certain favored house servants might repeat their vows before some white preacher with the massa and mistress looking on, but that was a pagan ceremony. If marrying someone in whatever manner was even to be thought about, the proper bride's age for a Mandinka was 14 to 16 reigns, with the man about 30, and in his years in the white folks' land, Quinta hadn't seen one black female of 14 to 16, or even 20 to 25, whom he had not considered preposterously giggling and silly, especially when on Sundays or for festivities they painted and powdered their faces until they looked to him more like the death dancers in Jafur, who covered themselves with ashes. As for the 20 or so older women whom Quinta had come to know, they were mostly senior cooks at the big houses where he had driven Massa Waller, such as Liza at Enfield. In fact, Liza was the only one among them all whom he had come to look forward to seeing. She had no mate, and she had given Quinta clear signs of her willingness, if not her anxiety, to get him into much closer quarters than he had ever responded to, although he had thought about it privately. He would have died of shame if there had been any way for her to suspect, even remotely, that more than once it had been she about whom he had had the sticky dream. Suppose, just suppose, he were to take Liza for a wife, Quinta thought. It would mean that they would be like so many couples he knew, living separately, each of them on the plantation of their own massa. Usually the man was permitted Saturday afternoon traveling passes to visit his wife, so long as he faithfully returned before dark on Sunday in order to rest up from his often long trip before work resumed at dawn on Monday. Quinta told himself that he would want no part of a wife living not where he was, and he told himself that settled the matter. But his mind, as if on its own, kept on thinking about it, considering how talkative and smothery Liza was, and how he liked to spend a lot of time alone. Maybe their being able to see each other just on weekends would be a blessing in disguise. And if he were to marry Liza, it was unlikely that they would have to live as so many black couples did, in fear that one of them, or both, might get sold away. For the Massa seemed to be happy with him, and Liza was owned by the Massa's parents, who apparently liked her. The family connections would also make unlikely the kind of frictions that sometimes arose when two Massas were involved, sometimes even causing one or both of them to forbid the marriage. On the other hand, Kunta thought, over and over he turned it in his mind, but no matter how many perfectly sound reasons he could think of for marrying Liza, something held him back. Then one night, while he was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, it struck him like a lightning bolt. There was another woman he might consider, Belle. He thought he must be crazy. She was nearly 3 times too old, probably beyond 40 reigns. It was absurd to think about it. Belle. Kunta tried to hurl her from his mind. She had entered it only because he had known her for so long, he told himself. He had never even dreamed of her. Grimly, he remembered a parade of indignities and irritations she had inflicted on him. He remembered how she used to all but slam the screen door in his face when he carried her vegetable basket to the kitchen. Even more keenly he remembered her indignation when he told her she looked Mandinka. She was a heathen. Furthermore, she was just generally argumentative and bossy, and she talked too much. But he couldn't help remembering how, when he had lain wanting to die, she had visited him 5 and 6 times daily, how she had nursed and fed him, even cleaned his soiling of himself, and how her hot poultice of mashed leaves had broken his fever. She was also strong and healthy, and she did cook endless good things in her black pots. The better she began to look to him, the ruder he was to her whenever he had to go to the kitchen. And the sooner he would leave when he had told her or found out from her whatever he had come for. She began to stare at his retreating back even more coldly than before. One day, after he had been talking for some time with the gardener and the fiddler, and worked the conversation very slowly around to Belle, it seemed to Kunta that he had just the right tone of casualness in his voice when he asked where she was fo she came here. But his heart sank when they instantly sat up straighter and looked at him, sensing something in the air. Well, the gardener said after a minute, I 'members she come here about 2 years fo you, but she ain't never done much talking about herself, so ain't much I knows more'n you does. The fiddler said Belle had never spoken of her past to him either. Kunta couldn't put his finger on what it was about their expressions that irritated him. Yes, he could. It was smugness. The fiddler scratched his right ear. Show is funny you ax 'bout Belle, he said, nodding in the gardener's direction. 'Cause me and him ain't been long back scussin' y'all. He looked carefully at Kunta. We was sayin' seem like y'all both might be just what the other needs, said the gardener. Outraged, Kunta sat with his mouth open, only nothing came out. Still scratching his ear, the fiddler wore a sly look. Yeah, her big behind be too much to handle for most mens. Kunta angrily started to speak, but the gardener cut him off, demanding sharply, Listen here, how long you ain't touched no woman? Kunta glared daggers. 20 years anyhow, exclaimed the fiddler. Lot God, said the gardener, you better get you some 'fore you dries up. If he ain't a-ready, the fiddler shot in. Unable to speak, but able to contain himself a moment longer, Kunta leaped up and stamped out. Don't you worry, the fiddler shouted after him. You ain't goin' to stay dry long wid her. Chapter 64. For the next few days, whenever Kunta wasn't driving off the Massa somewhere, he spent both his mornings and afternoons oiling and polishing the buggy. Since he was right outside the barn in anyone's view, it couldn't be said that he was isolating himself again, but at the same time it said that his work was keeping him too busy to spend time talking with the fiddler and the gardener, at whom he was still furious for what they had said about him and Belle. Being off by himself also gave him more time to sort out his feelings for her. Whenever he was thinking of something he didn't like about her, his polishing rag would become a furious blur against the leather, and whenever he was feeling better about her, it would move slowly and sensuously across the seats, sometimes almost stopping as his mind lingered on some disarming quality of hers. Whatever her shortcomings, he had to admit that she had done a great deal in his best interests over the years. He felt certain that Belle had even played a quiet role in the masses having selected him as his buggy driver. There was no question that in her own subtle ways, Belle had more influence on the massa than anyone else on the plantation, or probably all of them put together. And a parade of smaller things came and went through Kunta's mind. He remembered a time back when he was gardening and Belle had noticed that he was often rubbing at his eyes, which had been itching him in a maddening way. Without a word, she had come out to the garden one morning with some wide leaves, still wet with dewdrops, which she shook into his eyes, whereupon the itching had soon stopped. Not that he felt any less strongly about the things he disapproved of in Belle. Kunta reminded himself as the rag picked up speed, most particularly her disgusting habit of smoking tobacco in a pipe. Even more objectionable was her way of dancing whenever there was some festivity among the blacks. He didn't feel that women shouldn't dance, or do so less than enthusiastically. What bothered him was that Belle seemed to go out of her way to make her behind shake in a certain manner, which he figured was the reason the fiddler and the gardener had said what they did about her. Belle's behind, of course, wasn't any of his business. He just wished she would show a little more respect for herself, and while she was at it, a little more toward him and other men. Her tongue, it seemed to him, was even worse than old Neoboto's. He wouldn't mind her being critical if she'd only keep it to herself, or do her criticizing in the company of other women, as it was done in Jafur. When Kunta had finished with the buggy, he began cleaning and oiling the leather harnesses, and for some reason as he did so, his mind went back to the old men in Jafur, who carved things from wood such as the knee-high slab of hickory on which he was sitting. He thought how carefully they would first select and then study some thoroughly seasoned piece of wood before they would ever touch it with their adzes and their knives. Kunta got up and toppled the hickory block over on its side, sending the beetles that lived beneath it scurrying away. After closely examining both ends of the block, he rolled it back and forth, tapping it with the piece of iron at different places, and always hearing the same solid, seasoned sound. It seemed to him that this excellent piece of wood was serving no real purpose, just sitting there. It was apparently only because someone had put it there long before, and no one had ever bothered to move it. Looking around to make sure no one was watching, Kunta rolled the block rapidly to his hut, where he stood it upright in a corner, closed the door, and went back to work. That night, after bringing the massa back from a trip to the county seat that seemed to take forever, Kunta couldn't sit through supper before getting another look at the hickory block, so he took the food along with him to his cabin. Not even noticing what he was eating, Kunta sat on the floor in front of it and studied it in the light from the flickering candle on his table. In his mind, he was seeing the mortar and pestle that Amoro had carved for Binta, who had worn it slick with many grindings of her corn. Merely to pass away some of his free time, Kunta told himself, When Massa Waller didn't want to go anywhere, Kunta began to chop away at the block with a sharp hatchet, making a rough shape of the outside rim of a mortar for grinding corn. By the third day, with a hammer and a wood chisel, he dug out the mortar's inside, also roughly, and then he began to carve with a knife. After a week, Kunta's fingers surprised him at how nimbly they flew, considering that he hadn't watched the old men in his village carving things for more than 20 rains. When he had finished the inside and the outside of the mortar, he found a seasoned hickory limb, perfectly straight and of the thickness of his arm, from which he soon made a pestle. Then he set about smoothing the upper part of the handle, scraping it first with a file, next with a knife, and finally with a piece of glass. Finished, they both sat in a corner of Kunta's hut for 2 more weeks. He would look at them now and then, reflecting that they wouldn't look out of place in his mother's kitchen. But now that he had made them, he was unsure what to do with them. At least that's what he told himself. Then one morning, without really thinking about why he was doing it, Kunta picked them up and took them along when he went to check with Belle to see if the Massa was going to need the buggy. When she gave him her brief, cold report from behind the screen door, saying that the Massa had no travel plans that morning, Kunta waited until her back was turned, and found himself setting the mortar and pestle down on the steps and turning to leave as fast as he could go. When Belle's ears caught the gentle thumping sound, which made her turn around, she first saw Kunta cripping away even more hurriedly than usual. Then she saw the mortar and pestle on the steps. Walking to the door, she peered out at Kunta until he had disappeared, then eased the screen door open and looked down at them. She was flabbergasted. Picking them up and bringing them inside, she examined its painstaking carving with astonishment, and then she began to cry. It was the first time in her 22 years on the Waller plantation that any man had made something for her with his own hands. She felt flooding guilt for the way she had been acting toward Kunta, and she remembered how peculiar the fiddler and the gardener had acted recently when she complained to them about him. They must have known of this, but she couldn't be certain, knowing how close-mouthed and reserved Kunta could be in his African way. Belle was confused about how she should feel, or how she should act the next time he came to check on the Massa again after lunch. She was glad she would have at least the rest of the morning to get her mind made up about that. Kunta, meanwhile, sat in his cabin feeling as if he were 2 people, one of them completely humiliated by the foolish and ridiculous thing the other one had just done, and felt almost deliriously happy and excited about it. What made him do it? What would she think? He dreaded having to return to the kitchen after lunch. Finally the hour came, and Kunta trudged up the walk as if he were going to his execution. When he saw that the mortar and pestle were gone from the back steps, his heart leaped and sank at the same time. Reaching the screen door, he saw that she had put them on the floor just inside, as if she were uncertain why Kunta had left them there. Turning when he knocked, as if she hadn't heard him coming, she tried to look calm as she unlatched the door and opened it for him to come on in. That was a bad sign, thought Kunta. She hadn't opened the door to him in months. But he wanted to come in, yet he couldn't seem to take that first step. Rooted where he stood, he asked matter-of-factly about the Massa, and Belle, concealing her hurt feelings in her confusion, managed to reply just as matter-of-factly that the Massa said he had no afternoon plans for the buggy either. As Kunta turned to go, she added hopefully, "He been writing letters all day." All of the possible things that Belle had thought of that she might say had fled her head. And as he turned again to go, she heard herself blurting, "What dat?" with a gesture toward the mortar and pestle. Kunta wished that he were anywhere else on earth, but finally he replied, almost angrily, "For you to grind corn with." Belle looked at him with her mingled emotions now clearly showing on her face. Seizing the silence between them as an excuse to leave, Kunta turned and hurried away without another word. Belle stood there, feeling like a fool. For the next 2 weeks, beyond exchanging greetings, neither of them said anything to each other. Then one day, at the kitchen door, Belle gave Kunta a round cake of cornbread. Mumbling his thanks, he took it back to his hut and ate it still hot from the pan and soaked with butter. He was deeply moved. Almost certainly she had made it with meal ground in the mortar he had given her, but even before this, he had decided that he was going to have a talk with Belle. When he checked in with her after lunch, he forced himself to say, as he had carefully rehearsed and memorized it, "I wants a word with you after supper." Belle didn't delay her response over long. "Don't make me no difference," she said too quickly, regretting it. By supper time, Kunta had worked himself into a state. Why had she said what she did? Was she really as indifferent as she seemed? And if she was, why did she make the cornbread for him? He would have it out with her. But neither he nor Belle had remembered to say exactly when or where they would meet. She must have intended for him to meet her at her cabin, he decided finally, but he hoped desperately that some emergency medical call would come for Massa Waller. When none did, and he knew he couldn't put it off any longer, he took a deep breath, opened his cabin door, and strolled casually over to the barn. Coming back outside swinging in his hand a set of harnesses that he figured would satisfy the curiosity of anyone who might happen to see him and wonder why he was out and around, he ambled on down to Slave Row to Belle's cabin and, looking around to make sure no one was around, knocked very quietly on the door. It opened almost before his knuckles touched the wood, and Belle stepped immediately outside. Glancing down at the harness, and then at Kunta, she said nothing, and when he didn't either, she began to walk slowly down toward the back fence row. He fell into step beside her. The half-moon had begun to rise, and in its pale light they moved along without a word. When a ground vine entangled the shoe on his left foot, Kunta stumbled, his shoulder brushing against Belle, and he all but sprang away. Ransacking his brain for something, anything to say, he wished wildly that he was walking with the gardener or the fiddler, or practically anyone except Belle. Finally, it was she who broke the silence. She said abruptly, "The white folks done swore in dat General Washington for the president." Kunta wanted to ask her what that was, but he didn't, hoping that she'd keep on talking. "And it's another massa name of John Adams, his vice president," she went on. Floundering, he felt that he must say something to keep the talk going. He said finally, "Rode massa over to see his brother's young'un yestiddy," instantly feeling foolish, as he knew full well that Belle already knew that. "Lord, he do love dat chile," Belle said, feeling foolish, since that's about all she ever said about little Missy Ann whenever the subject came up. The silence had built up a little bit again when she went on. "Don't know how much he knows about Massa's brother. He the Spotsylvania County Clerk, but he ain't never had our Massa's head fo' business." Belle was quiet for a few more steps. "I keeps my ears sharp on little things gets dropped. I knows whole lot more'n anybody thinks I knows." She glanced over at Kunta. "I ain't never had no use for that Massa John, and I's sure you ain't neither. But there's something you ought to know about him that I ain't never told you. It weren't him had your foot cut off. Fact, he pitched a fit with them low-down po white trash what done it. He hired 'em to track you with they dogs, and they claim how come they done it was you tried to kill one of 'em with a rock." Belle paused. "I 'members it like yestiddy, when Sheriff Brock come a rushin' you to our massa." Under the moonlight, Belle looked at Quinta. "You near 'bout dead," Massa said. "He got so mad when Massa John say he ain't got no use for you no more with your foot gone. He swore he gon' buy you from him, and he done it too. I seen the very deed he bought you wid. He took over a good-sized farm long wid you in the place of money his brother owed him. It's that big farm with the pond right where the big road curve. You passes it all the time." Quinta knew the farm instantly. He could see the pond in his mind, and the surrounding fields. But they business dealin's don't make no difference. "'Cause all them Wallers is very close," Belle continued. "They's 'mongst the oldest families in Virginia. Fact, they was all family in that England even 'fore they come cross the water to here. Was all kinds of sirs and stuff, all belonging to the Church of England. Was one of them what writ poems. Name of Massa Edmund Waller. His younger brother Massa John Waller was the one what comes here first. He weren't but 18, I's heard Massa say, when some King Charles II gave him a big land grant over where Kent County is now." Their pace had become much slower as Belle talked, and Quinta couldn't have been more pleased with Belle's steady talking, although he had already heard from some other Waller family cooks at least some of the things she was saying, though he never would have told her that. Anyhow, this John Waller married a Miss Mary Kay, and they built the Enfield big house where you takes Massa to see us folks. And they had 3 boys, specially John II, the youngest, who come to be a whole heap of things. Read the law while he was a sheriff, then was in the House of Burgesses, and he helped to found Fredericksburg and to put together Spotsylvania County. It was him and his Mrs. Dorothy what built Newport, and they had 6 young'uns. And course out of all them, it commenced to be Waller chillens spreadin' all over, and growin' on up, and havin' young'uns of they own. Our massa and the other Wallers what lives round here ain't but a handful of 'em all. They's all pretty much high-respected peoples, too. Sheriffs and preachers, county clerks, House of Burgesses, doctors like Massa. Whole heap of 'em fought in the Revolution, and I don't know what all." Quinta had become so absorbed in what Belle was saying that he was startled when she stopped talking. "We better get on back," she said. "Traipsin' out here till all hours 'mongst these weeds. Be over sleepin' in the mornin'." They turned around, and when Belle was quiet for a minute, and Quinta didn't say anything, she realized that he wasn't going to tell her whatever he had on his mind, so she went on chattering about whatever came into her mind until they got back to her cabin, where she turned to face him and fell silent. He stood there looking at her for a long, agonizing moment, and then finally he spoke. "Well, it gettin' late like you said, so I see you tomorrow." As he walked away, still carrying the harnesses, Belle realized that he hadn't told her whatever it was that he wanted to talk to her about. Well, she told herself, afraid to think that it might be what she thought it was. He'll get around to it in his own time. It was just as well that she wasn't in a hurry, for though Quinta began to spend a lot of time in Belle's kitchen as she went about her work, she found herself, as usual, doing most of the talking. But she liked having him there to listen. "I found out," she told him one day, "that Massa done writ out a will that if he die and ain't got married, his slaves gon' go to little Missy Ann. But de will say if he do marry, then he wife would get us slaves when he die." Even so, Belle didn't seem to be unduly disturbed. "Show is a plenty of 'em round here would love to grab de Massa, but he ain't never married no mo'." She paused. "Just the same as I ain't." Kunta almost dropped the fork from his hand. He was positive that he had heard Belle correctly, and he was jolted to know that Belle had been married before, for it was unthinkable that a desirable wife should not be a virgin. Kunta soon was out of the kitchen and gone into his own cabin. He knew that he must think hard upon this matter. 2 weeks of silence had passed before Belle casually invited Kunta to eat supper with her in her cabin that night. He was so astounded that he didn't know what to say. He had never been alone in a hut with a woman other than his own mother or grandmother. It wouldn't be right. But when he couldn't find the words to speak, she told him what time to show up, and that was that. He scrubbed himself in a tin tub from head to foot, using a rough cloth and a bar of brown lye soap. Then he scrubbed himself again, and yet a third time. Then he dried himself, and while he was putting on his clothes, he found himself singing softly a song from his village. Madame B, your long neck is very beautiful. Belle didn't have a long neck, nor was she beautiful, but he had to admit to himself that when he was around her, he had a good feeling, and he knew that she felt the same. Belle's cabin was the biggest one on the plantation, and the one nearest to the big house, with a small bed of flowers growing before it. Knowing her kitchen, her cabin's immaculate neatness was no more than Kunta would expect. The room he entered when she opened the door had a feeling of cozy comfort. With its wall of mud-chinked logs and a chimney of homemade bricks that widened down from the roof to her large fireplace, alongside which hung her shining cooking utensils. And Kunta noticed that instead of the usual one room with one window, such as he had, Belle's cabin had 2 rooms and 2 windows, both covered with shutters that he could pull down in case of rain, or when it grew cold. The curtained rear room was obviously where she slept, and Kunta kept his eyes averted from that doorway. On her oblong table in the center of the room he was in, there were knives and forks and spoons standing in a jar, and some flowers from her garden in another, and 2 lighted candles were sitting in squat clay holders, and at either end of the table was a high-backed, cane-bottomed chair. Belle asked him to sit in a rocking chair that was nearer the fireplace. He did, sitting down carefully, for he had never been in one of these contraptions before, but was trying hard to act casual about the whole visit as Belle seemed to be. "I've been so busy I ain't even lit the fire," she said, and Kunta all but leaped up out of the chair, glad to have something he could do with his hands. Striking the flint sharply against the piece of iron, he lighted the fluffy cotton that Belle had already placed under fat pine sticks beneath the oak logs, and quickly they caught fire. "Don't know how come I axed you to come here nohow. Place in a mess, and I ain't got nothin' ready," Belle said, bustling about her pots. "Ain't no hurry wid me," Kunta made himself respond. But her already cooked chicken with dumplings, which she well knew that Kunta loved, was soon bubbling. And when she had served him, she chided him for gobbling so. But Kunta didn't quit until the 3rd helping, with Belle insisting that there was still a little more in the pot. "Nah, I's fit to bus," said Kunta truthfully, and after a few more minutes of small talk, he got up and said he had to get on home. Pausing in the doorway, he looked at Belle, and Belle looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and then Belle turned her eyes away, and Kunta crept on down along Slave Road to his own cabin. He awakened more light-hearted than he had felt since leaving Africa, but he told no one why he was acting so uncharacteristically cheerful and outgoing. But he hardly needed to. Word began to get around that Kunta had actually been seen smiling and even laughing in Belle's kitchen. And at first every week or so, then twice a week, Belle would invite Kunta home for supper. Though he thought that once in a while he should make some excuse, he could never bring himself to say no. And always Belle cooked things Kunta had let her know were also grown in the Gambia, such as black-eyed peas, okra, a stew made of peanuts, or yams baked with butter. Most of their conversations were still one-sided, but neither one seemed to mind. Her favorite topic, of course, was Massa Waller, and it never ceased to amaze Kunta how much Belle knew that he didn't about the man he spent so much more time with than she did. Massa funny about different things, Belle said. Like he believe in banks, all right enough, but he keep money hid, too. Nobody else know where but me. He funny about his too. He do about anything for 'em, but if one mess up, he'll sell 'em just like he done Luther. Another thing Massa funny bout, Belle went on, he won't have a yaller on his place. You ever notice, 'ceptin' for the fiddler, ain't nothin' here but black. Massa tell anybody just what he think about it too. I done heard him tellin' some of the biggest mens in dis country, I mean ones that got plenty yaller deyselves, that too many white mens is havin' slave chillin's, so dey ain't doin' nothin' but buyin' and sellin' dey own blood, and it need to be stopped. Though he never showed it, and he kept up a steady drone of uh-huhs when Belle was talking, Kunta would sometimes listen with one ear while he thought about something else. Once when she cooked him a hoe cake, using meal she had made in the mortar and pestle he had carved for her, Kunta was watching her in his mind's eye beating the couscous for breakfast in some African village, while she stood at the stove telling him that hoe cakes got their name from slaves cooking them on the flat edge of a hoe when they were working out in the fields. Now and then Belle even gave Kunta some special dish to take to the fiddler and the gardener. He wasn't seeing as much of them as he had, but they seemed to understand, and the time they spent apart even seemed to increase the pleasure of conversation with them whenever they got together. Though he never discussed Belle with them, and they never brought her up, it was clear from their expressions that they knew she and he were courtin', as well as if their meetings took place on the front lawn. Kunta found this vaguely embarrassing, but there seemed to be nothing he could do about it, not that he particularly cared to. He was more concerned that there remained some serious matters he wanted to take up with Belle, but he never could quite seem to get around to them. Among them was the fact that she kept on her front room wall a large framed picture of the yellow-haired Jesus, who seemed to be a relative of their heathen, O Laud. But finally he did manage to mention it, and Belle promptly said, "Ain't but two places everybody's headin' for, heaven or hell, and where you goin', that's yo' business." And she would say no more about it. Her reply discomfited him every time he thought of it, but finally he decided that she had a right to her beliefs, however misguided, just as he had a right to his. Unshaken, he had been born with Allah and he was going to die with Allah, although he hadn't been praying to him regularly again ever since he started seeing a lot of Belle. He resolved to correct that, and hoped that Allah would forgive him. Anyway, he couldn't feel too harshly about someone, even a pagan Christian, who was so good to one of another faith, even someone as worthy as he was. She was so nice to him, in fact, that Kunta wanted to do something special for her, something at least as special as the mortar and pestle. So one day, when he was on his way over to Massa John's to pick up Missy Ann for a weekend visit with Massa Waller, Kunta stopped off by a fine patch of bulrushes he had often noticed, and picked some of the best he could find. With the rushes split into fine pieces, and with some selected, soft inner white corn shucks, over the next several days he plaited an intricate mat with a bold Mandinka design in its center. It came out even better than he had expected, and he presented it to Belle the next time she had him over for supper. She looked upward from the mat to Kunta. "Ain't nobody goin' put dey feets on dat," she exclaimed, turning and disappearing into her bedroom. Back a few moments later, with a hand behind her, she said, "Dis was going to be for yo' Christmas, but I make you something else." She held out her hand. It was a pair of finely knitted woolen socks, one of them with a half-foot, the front part filled with soft woolen cushion. Neither he nor Belle seemed to know what to say. He could smell the aroma of the food she had been simmering, ready to be served, but a strange feeling was sweeping over him as they kept on looking at each other. Belle's hand suddenly grasped his, and with a single motion she blew out both of the candles, and swiftly, with Kunta feeling as if he were a leaf being borne by a rushing stream, they went together through the curtained doorway into the other room, and lay down facing one another on the bed. Looking deeply into his eyes, she reached out to him. They drew together, and for the first time in the 39 reigns of his life, he held a woman in his arms. Chapter 65. Massa ain't want to believe me when I tole him, Belle said to Kunta, but he finally say he feel us ought to think on it for a spell yet, 'cause people's getting married is sacred in the eyes of Jesus. To Kunta, however, Massa Waller said not a word about it during the next few weeks. Then one night, Belle came running out to Kunta's cabin and reported breathlessly, "I done tole him we still wants to marry, and he say, well den, he reckon it's all right." The news coursed swiftly through Slave Row. Kunta was embarrassed as different ones offered their congratulations. He could have choked Belle for telling even Missy Ann when she came next to visit her uncle, for the first thing she did after finding out was race about screaming, "Belle gon' get married! Belle gon' get married!" Yet at the same time, deep inside himself, Kunta felt that it was improper for him to feel any displeasure at such an announcement, since the Mandinka people considered marriage to be the most important thing after birth itself. Belle somehow managed to get the Massa's promise not to use the buggy or Kunta for the entire Sunday before Christmas, when everyone would be off work and therefore available to attend the wedding. "I knows you don't want no marriage in the big house," she told Kunta, "like we could have had if I asked Massa. And I knows he don't really want that neither, so at least y'all together on dat." She arranged for it to be held in the front yard alongside the oval flower garden. Everybody on Slave Row was there in their Sunday best, and standing together on across from them were Massa Waller and little Missy Ann and her parents. But as far as Kunta was concerned, the guest of honor, and, in a very real sense, the one responsible for the whole thing, was his friend the Ghanaian, who had hitched a ride all the way from Enfield just to be there. As Kunta walked with Belle out into the center of the yard, he turned his head toward the quaqua player, and they exchanged a long look before Belle's main praying and singing friend, Aunt Suki, the plantation's laundress, stepped forward to conduct the ceremony. After calling for all present to stand closer together, she said, "Now I ax everybody here to pray for this union that God 'bout to make. I wants y'all to pray that this here couple is gonna stay together." She hesitated, "and that nothing don't happen to cause 'em to get soul away from one another. And pray that they has good, healthy young'uns." And then very solemnly, Aunt Suki placed a broomstick on the close-cropped grass just in front of Kunta and Belle, whom she now motioned to link their arms. Kunta felt as if he were suffocating. In his mind was flashing how marriages were conducted in his Jafur. He could see the dancers, hear the praise singers and the prayers, and the talking drums relaying the glad tidings to other villages. He hoped that he would be forgiven for what he was doing, that whatever words were spoken to their pagan god, Allah would understand that Kunta still believed in him and only him. And then, as if from afar, he heard Aunt Suki asking, "Now y'all two is show you wants to get married?" Softly, alongside Kunta, Belle said, "I does." And Aunt Suki turned her gaze to Kunta. He felt her eyes boring into him, and then Belle was squeezing his arm very hard. He forced the words from his mouth, "I does." And then Aunt Suki said, "Den in the eyes of Jesus, y'all jump into the holy land of matrimony." Kunta and Belle jumped high over the broomstick together, as Belle had forced him to practice over and over the day before. He felt ridiculous doing it, but she had warned that a marriage would meet the very worst kind of bad luck if the feet of either person should touch the broomstick, and whoever did it would be the first to die. As they landed safely together on the other side of the broom, all the observers applauded and cheered, and when they had quieted, Aunt Suki spoke again. "What God done joined, let no man pull asunder. Now y'all be faithful to one another." She looked at Kunta directly. "And be good Christians." Aunt Suki turned next to look at Massa Waller. "Massa, is it anything you cares to say for this here occasion?" The Massa clearly looked as if he would prefer not to, but he stepped forward and spoke softly. "He's got a good woman in Belle, and she's got a good boy, and my family here, along with myself, wish them the rest of their lives of good luck." The loud cheering that followed from all of the Slave Row people was punctuated with the happy squeals of little Missy Ann, who was jumping up and down until her mother pulled her away, and all the Wallers went into the big house to let the blacks continue the celebration in their own way. Aunt Suki and other friends of Belle's had helped her cook enough pots of food that they all but hid the top of a long table. And amid the feasting and good cheer, everyone there but Kunta and the Ghanaian partook of the brandy and wines that the Massa had sent up from the big house cellar as his gift. With the fiddler playing steadily and loudly on his instrument ever since the party began, Kunta didn't know how he'd managed to sneak a drink, but from the way he swayed as he played, it was clear that he'd managed to get a hold of more than one. He had endured the fiddler's drinking so often that he was resigned to it, but when he saw Belle busy filling and refilling her wine glass, he began to get increasingly concerned and embarrassed. He was shocked to overhear her exclaiming to Sister Mandy, another of her friends, "Been had my eye on him for 10 years." And not long after that, she wobbled over, threw her arms around him, and kissed him full on the mouth right there in front of everyone, amid crude jokes, elbows in the ribs, and uproarious laughter. Kunta was taut as a bowstring by the time the rest of the guests finally began to take their leave. Finally, they were all alone there in the yard, and as Belle wove unsteadily toward him, she said softly in a slurred voice, "Now you done bought the cow, you gets all the milk you wants." He was horrified to hear her talk so. But it wasn't long before he got over it. In fact, before many weeks had passed, he had gained considerably more knowledge of what a big, strong, healthy woman was really like. His hands had explored in the darkness until now he knew for a certainty that Belle's big behind was entirely her own, and none of it was one of those padded bustles that he had heard many women were wearing to make their behinds look big. Though he hadn't seen her naked, she always blew out the candles before he got the chance. He had been permitted to see her breasts, whose largeness he noted with satisfaction were the kind that would supply much milk for a man-child, and that was very good. But it had been with horror that Kunta first saw the deep lash marks on Belle's back. "I's carryin' scars to my grave just like my mammy did," Belle said, "but my back sure ain't as bad as your'n." And Kunta was taken with surprise, for he hadn't seen his own back. He had all but forgotten all those lashings over 20 years ago. With her warmth always beside him, Kunta greatly enjoyed sleeping in Belle's tall bed on its soft mattress, filled as it was with cotton instead of straw or corn shucks. Her hand-made quilts, too, were comfortable and warm, and it was a completely new, luxurious experience for him to sleep between a pair of sheets. Almost as pleasurable for him were the nicely fitted shirts she made for him, then washed, starched, and ironed freshly every day. Belle even softened the leather of his stiff, high-topped shoes by greasing them with tallow, and she knitted him more socks that were thickly cushioned to fit his half foot. After years of driving the massa all day and returning at night to a cold supper before crawling onto his solitary pallet, now Belle saw to it that the same supper she fed the massa, unless it was pork of course, was simmering over the fireplace in their cabin when he got home, and he liked eating on her white crockery dishes with the knives, spoons, and forks she had obviously supplied for herself from the big house. Belle had even whitewashed her cabin. He often had to remind himself that now it was their cabin, on the outside as well as the inside. All in all, he was amazed to find that he liked almost everything about her, and he would have rebuked himself for not having come to his senses sooner if he hadn't been feeling too good to spend much time thinking about all the years he'd wasted. He just couldn't believe how different things were, how much better life was than it had been just a few months before and a few yards away. Chapter 66. As close as they'd become since they jumped to Broome, there were times when Kunta would sense that Belle still didn't totally trust him. Sometimes when she was talking to him in the kitchen or the cabin, she would nearly say something, then abruptly veer off onto another subject, filling Kunta with a rush of anger that only his pride enabled him to conceal. And on more than one occasion he had learned things from the fiddler or the gardener that had to have been picked up at the massa's keyhole. It didn't matter to him what it was that she was telling them. What hurt was that she wasn't telling him, that she was keeping secrets from her own husband. What hurt him even more was that he had always been so open in sharing with her and them news they might never have learned otherwise, or at least not for a long time. Kunta began to let weeks go by without telling even Belle about whatever he had overheard in town. When she finally said something to him about it, he said he guessed things had just been kind of quiet lately, and maybe it's just as well because the news never seemed to be any good. But the next time he came back from town, he figured she'd learned her lesson, and he told her that he'd overheard the massa telling one of his friends that he'd just read that in New Orleans, a white doctor named Benjamin Rush had written recently that when his longtime black assistant, a slave named James Durham, had learned as much medicine from him as he felt he knew himself, he had set him free. Ain't he the one what become a doctor hisself and got even mo famous than the man what learned him? Asked Belle. How you know dat? Massa say he just read 'bout it hisself, and ain't nobody been here fo you to hear him tell about it, said Kunta, as irritated as he was perplexed. Oh, I got my ways, Belle replied mysteriously, changing the subject. As far as Kunta was concerned, that was the last time she'd ever hear any news from him, and he didn't say another word about it, or almost anything else, for the next week or so. Finally, Belle got the hint, and after a good dinner by candlelight there in the cabin one Sunday night, she put her hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Something been hard on my mind to tell you." Going into their bedroom, she returned in a moment with one of the Virginia Gazettes that Kunta knew she had kept a stack beneath her bed. He had always assumed that she simply enjoyed turning the pages, as he knew so many blacks did, as well as those poor whites who walked around on Saturdays in the county seat with newspapers opened before their faces, though Kunta and everyone else who saw them knew perfectly well that they couldn't read a word. But in some way now, as he saw the secretive look on Belle's face, he sensed with astonishment what she was about to say. "I can read some," Belle hesitated. "Massa sell me fo sunup if'n he know dat." Kunta made no response, for he had learned that Belle would do more talking on her own than if she was asked questions. "I's knowed some of de words ever since I was a youngin'," she continued. "It were de chillens of my massa back den what teached me. Dey liked to play teacher, 'cause dey was going to school, and de massa and missus didn't pay it no 'tention on 'count of how de white folks tell deyselves dat is too dumb to learn anything." Kunta thought about the old black he saw regularly at the Spotsylvania County Courthouse, who had swept and mopped there for years, with none of the whites ever dreaming that he had copied the handwriting they left lying around on papers until he had gotten good enough at it to forge and sign traveling passes, which he sold to blacks. Peering hard at the tip of her forefinger as it moved the paper's front edge, Belle said finally, "Here where the House of Burgesses done met again." She studied the print closely, then passed a new law about taxes. Quinta was simply amazed. Belle moved to a place farther down the page. "Right here it's something another about that England done sent some from there back to Africa." Belle glanced upward at Quinta. "You want me to pick out mo what they said about that?" Quinta nodded. Belle needed several minutes of staring at her finger, with her lips silently forming letters and sounds. Then she spoke again. "Well, ain't sure about it all, but 400 done been sent somewheres called, look like Sierra Leone, on land to England bought from a king that's there, and is been give some land apiece long with some money for allowance." When it seemed as if the very effort of reading had fatigued her, she went thumbing through the inside pages, pointing out to Quinta one after another identical small figures that were recognizable as men carrying a bundle at the end of a stick over their shoulders. And with her finger on the block of print under one of these figures, she said, "That's always scribing these runaway like it was one 'bout you the last time you run off. It tell what color they is, what marks they got on they faces or arms or legs or backs from being beat or branded. And it tell what they was wearin' when they run off, and sich as that. And then it tell who they belongs to, and what reward bein' offered to whoever catch them and bring them back. I seen it be much as 500, and I seen it be where the done run so much that Hamasa so mad he advertised $10 for the live back and 15 for just his head." Finally she set the paper down with a sigh, seemingly fatigued by the effort of reading. "Now you knows how I found out about that doctor." "Same way the massa did." Quinta asked if she didn't think she might be taking chances reading the massa's paper like that. "I's real careful," she said, "but I tell you one time I got scared to death with massa," Belle added. "One day he just walked in on me when I was supposed to be dustin' in the living room, but what I was doin' was lookin' in one of them books of his'n. Lawd, I like to froze. Massa just stood there a minute lookin' at me, but he never said nothin'. He just walked out, and from the next day to this day, it's been a lock on his bookcase." When Belle put away the newspaper back under the bed, she was quiet for a while, and Quinta knew her well enough by now to know that she still had something on her mind. They were about ready to go to bed when she abruptly seated herself at the table, as if she had just made up her mind about something, and with an expression both furtive and proud on her face, drew from her apron pocket a pencil and a folded piece of paper. Smoothing out the paper, she began to print some letters very carefully. "You know what that is?" she asked, and before Quinta could say no, answered, "Well, that's my name, Bell." Quinta stared at the penciled characters, remembering of how for years he had shrunk away from any closeness to two-bob writing, thinking it contained some two-bob gree-grees that might bring him harm. But he still wasn't too sure that was so far-fetched. Belle now printed some more letters. "That's your name, Kunta." She beamed up at him. Despite himself, Quinta couldn't resist bending a little closer to study the strange markings. Then Belle got up, crumpled the paper, and threw it onto the dying embers in the fireplace. "Ain't never gonna get caught with no writin'." Several weeks had passed before Kunta finally decided to do something about an irritation that had been eating at him ever since Belle showed him so proudly that she could read and write. Like their white masses, these plantation-born blacks seemed to take it for granted that those who had come from Africa had just climbed down from the trees, let alone had any experience whatever with education. So very casually one evening after supper, he knelt down before the cabin's fireplace and raked a pile of ashes out onto the hearth, then used his hands to flatten and smooth them out. With Belle watching curiously, he then took a slender whittled stick from his pocket and proceeded to scratch into the ashes his name in Arabic characters. Belle wouldn't let him finish, demanding, "What dat?" Kunta told her. Then, having made his point, he swept the ashes back into the fireplace, sat down in the rocking chair, and waited for her to ask him how he'd learned to write. He didn't have long to wait, and for the rest of the evening he talked, and Belle listened for a change. In his halting speech, Kunta told her how all the children in his village were taught to write, with pens made of hollowed dried grass stalks, and ink of water mixed with crushed pot black. He told her about the Arafang, and how his lessons were conducted both mornings and evenings. Warming to his subject, and enjoying the novelty of seeing Belle with her mouth shut for a while, Kunta told her how the students in Jafur had to be able to read well from the Qur'an before they could graduate, and he even recited for her some Qur'anic verses. He could tell she was intrigued, but it seemed amazing to him that this was the very first time in all the years he'd known her that she had ever shown the slightest interest in anything about Africa. Belle tapped the top of the table between them. "How y'all Africans say table?" she asked. Although he hadn't spoken in Mandinka since he left Africa, the word miso popped from Kunta's mouth almost before he realized it, and he felt a surge of pride. "How about dat?" asked Belle, pointing at her chair. "Sirango," said Kunta. He was so pleased with himself that he got up and began to walk around in the cabin, pointing at things. Tapping Belle's black iron pot over the fireplace, he said, "Calero," and then a candle on the table, "Candio." Astonished, Belle had risen from her chair and was following him around. Kunta nudged a burlap bag with his shoe and said, "Boto," touched a dried gourd and said, "Mirango," then a basket that the old gardener had woven, "Sinsingo." He led Belle on into their bedroom, "Larango," he said, pointing to their bed, and then a pillow, "Kunglarang." Then at the window, "Janarango," and at the roof, "Kenkarango." "Lord have mercy!" exclaimed Belle. That was far more respect for his homeland than he had ever expected to arouse in Belle. "Now it time to put her head on de Kunglarang," said Kunta, sitting down on the edge of the bed and starting to undress. Belle knitted her brow, then laughed and put her arms around him. He hadn't felt so good in a long time. Chapter 67. Though Kunta still liked to visit and swap stories with the fiddler and the gardener, it didn't happen nearly as often as it used to when he was single. This was hardly surprising, since he spent most of his free time with Belle now. But even when they did get together lately, they seemed to feel differently toward him than before. Certainly not unfriendly, but undeniably less companionable. It had been they who practically pushed Kunta into Belle's arms. Yet now that he was married, they acted a little as if they were afraid it might be catching, or that it might never be. His obvious contentment with hearth and home didn't make them feel any warmer on cold winter nights. But if he didn't feel as close to them as before, in the comradeship they had shared as single men, despite their different origins, he felt somehow more accepted now, as if by marrying Belle he had become one of them. Though their conversations with their married friend weren't as earthy as they had sometimes been before, not that Kunta would admit even to himself that he had ever enjoyed the fiddler's crudities, They had become, with the building of trust and the passage of years, even deeper and more serious. "Scairt," declared the fiddler one night. "Dat's how come white folks so busy countin' everybody in dat census. Dey scairt dey's done brung mo' 'mongst 'em dan dey is white folks," declared the fiddler. Kunta said that Belle had told him she'd read in the Gazette that in Virginia the census had recorded only a few more thousand whites than blacks. "White folks scairder of free dan dey is of us'uns," the old gardener put in. "I's heerd it's near about 60,000 free jes' in Virginia," the fiddler said. So it ain't no tellin' how many slave. But even dis state ain't where de mos' is. Dat's down in dem states where de richest land make the best crops, and dey got water for boats to take dey crops to de markets, and yeah, dem places it be's too for every white folks," the old gardener interrupted, "all down in dat Louisiana Delta, and de Yazoo, Mississippi, where dey grows sugar cane, and all down in dat black belt of Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia, where dey grows all dat rice and indigo. Let me tell you dat down on dem great big way back plantations, dey's got all kinds of ain't never been counted. Some of dem plantations so big dey's split up into littler ones with the overseers in charge," the fiddler said. "And the masses that owns dem big plantations is mostly dem big lawyers and politicians and businessmen what lives in de cities. And dey women folks don't want no parts of no plantations, 'ceptin' maybe to bring out fancy carriages full of dey friends, maybe for Thanksgivin' or Christmas, or summertime picnics." "But you know what?" the old gardener exclaimed. "Dem rich city white folks is de very kind 'mongst which it's dem dat speaks 'gainst slavery." The fiddler cut him off. "Humph! Dat don't mean nothin'. Always been some big white folks dat wants de slavery 'bolished. Shoot, slavery been outlawed here in Virginia 10 years now, but law or no, you notice we still slaves, and dey still bringin' in more shiploads of—" "Where dey all bein' taken?" asked Kunta. "Some buggy drivers I knows say dey masses go on long trips where dey done hardly see another black face for days at a time. It's a plenty whole counties dat ain't even got one big plantation on 'em, and hardly no at all," said the gardener. "Just nothin' but them little rocky farms dat's sold for 50 cents a acre to dem white folks so po' dey eats dirt. And not a whole lot better off than dem is the ones dat got not much better land and just a handful of slaves. One place I heerd 'bout ain't got no handful o'. It's dem West Indies, whatever dem is," said the fiddler, turning to Kunta. "You know where? It's 'cross the water like you come from." Kunta shook his head. "Anyway," the fiddler went on, "I hears it's many as 1,000 belongin' to one massa dere, raisin' and cuttin' dat cane dat dey makes sugar and 'lasses and rum out of. Dey's tell me a whole lots of dem ships like brung you over here stops off African in dem West Indies to keep 'em a while just to fatten 'em up from dem long trips dat gets 'em so sick and starved dey's near about dead. Fattens 'em up, den brings 'em on here to get de better prices for dat's fit to work. Leastways, dat's what I's heerd." It had never failed to amaze Kunta how the fiddler and the gardener seemed to know so much about things they'd never seen and places they'd never been to, for he distinctly recalled having heard both of them say they had never been outside of Virginia and North Carolina. He had traveled far more widely than they had, not only all the way from Africa, but also back and forth across the state in the masses' buggy. But they still knew so much more than he did that even after all these years of talking to them, he was finding out things he hadn't known before. It didn't really bother Kunta to find out how ignorant he was, since they were helping him become less so, but it troubled him deeply to learn over the years that even he was better informed than the average slave. From what he'd been able to observe, most blacks literally didn't even know where they were, let alone who they were. I bet you have to in Virginia ain't never been off de Mass's plantations, said Belle when he raised the subject with her, and ain't never heard of nowhere else 'cept in maybe Richmond and Fredericksburg and up north, and don't have no idea where none of them is. The white folks keep ignorant o' where they is 'cause they so worried about uprising or 'scaping. Before Kunta had the chance to recover from his surprise at hearing an insight like this one coming from Belle rather than the fiddler or the gardener, she spoke again. "You reckon you still would run again if'n you had the chance?" Kunta was stunned by the question, and for a long time he didn't answer. Then finally he said, "Well, long time I ain't done no thinking 'bout that. Whole lots of times I be's thinking a heap o' things nobody wouldn't figure I does," said Belle. "Like sometime I gets to thinking 'bout bein' free, like I hears 'bout dem dat gets away up to de north." She looked docilely at Kunta. "Don't care how good the massa is. I gets to feelin' like if you and me was younger'n we is, I believe I'd be ready to leave way from here tonight." As Kunta sat there astonished, she said quietly, "Reckon I's gotta be too old and scairt now." Belle could have been reading the thought he was having at that moment about himself, and it hit him like a fist. He was too old to run away again, and too beat up, and scared. All the pain and terror of those terrible days and nights of running came back, the blistered feet, the bursting lungs, the bleeding hands, the tearing thorns, the baying of the hounds, the snarling jaws, the gunshots, the sting of the lash, the falling axe. Without even realizing it, Kunta had plunged into a black depression, knowing that she had aroused it without meaning to, but knowing also that she'd only make it worse by talking about it any further, even to apologize. Belle simply got up and went to bed. When he finally realized that she was gone, Kunta felt badly that he had cut her out of his thoughts, and it pained him to think how grievously he had underestimated her and the other blacks. Though they never showed it except to those they loved, and sometimes not even then, he realized at last that they felt and hated no less than he the oppressiveness under which they all lived. He wished he could find a way to tell her how sorry he was, how he felt her pain, how grateful he was to feel her love, how strong he felt the bond between them growing deep within himself. Quietly he got up, went into the bedroom, took off his clothes, got into bed, took her in his arms and made love to her, and she to him, with a kind of desperate intensity. Chapter 68. For several weeks it seemed to Kunta that Belle had been acting very oddly. For one thing, she was hardly talking, but she wasn't even in a bad mood, and she was casting what he felt were peculiar looks at him, then sighing loudly when he stared back, and she had begun smiling mysteriously to herself while rocking in her chair, sometimes even humming tunes. Then one night, just after they'd blown out the candle and climbed into bed, she grasped Kunta's hand and placed it tenderly on her stomach. Something inside her moved beneath his hand. Kunta sprang up, fit to split with joy. Over the next days, he hardly noticed where he was driving. For all he knew, the master could have been pulling the buggy and the horses sitting on the seat behind him. So filled was his mind's eye of visions of Belle paddling down the Bolong to the rice fields with his man-child bundled snugly on her back. He thought of nothing else but the myriad significances of this coming firstborn, even as for Binta and Amaro he had been the firstborn. He vowed that just as they and others had done for him in Jafur, he was going to teach this man-child to be a true man, no matter what trials and hazards that might involve here in the land of the Two-Bob. For it was the job of a father to be as a giant tree to his man-child. For where girl children simply ate food until they grew big enough to marry and go away, and girl children were their mother's concerns in any case, it was the man-child who carried on his family's name and reputation, and when the time came that his parents were old and tottering, it would be the well-reared man-child who put nothing before taking care of them. Bel's pregnancy took Kunta's mind even farther back to Africa than his encounter with the Ghanaian had done. One night, in fact, he completely forgot Bel was in the cabin while he patiently counted out all the pebbles in his gourd, discovering with astonishment that he hadn't seen his homeland now for exactly 22.5 rains. But most evenings she would be talking almost steadily while he sat there hearing less than usual and gazing off at nothing. "He'd just go off into his Africanisms," Bel would tell Aunt Suki, and after a while Bel would rise unnoticed from her chair, quietly leave the room, muttering to herself, and go to sleep alone. It had been one such night when, about an hour after she'd gone to bed, Kunta was snapped back to the cabin by moans from the bedroom. Was it time? Rushing in, he found her still asleep, but rolling back and forth on the verge of screaming. When he leaned over to touch her cheek, she sat bolt upright there in the darkness, soaked with sweat and breathing hard. "Lord, I'm scared to death for this baby in my belly," she said as she put her arms around him. Kunta didn't understand until she composed herself enough to tell how she had dreamed that at a white folks' party game they had announced that the first prize would be the next black baby to be born on that Massa's plantation. Bel was so distraught that Kunta found himself in the unaccustomed role of calming her with assurances that she knew Massa Waller would never do such a thing. He made her agree with that, then climbed into bed alongside her, and finally she went back to sleep. But Kunta didn't. He lay thinking for quite some time of how he had heard of such things being done, of unborn black babies being given as presents, wagered as gambling bets at card tables and cockfights. The fiddler had told him how the dying mass of a pregnant 15-year-old black girl named Mary had willed as slaves to each of his 5 daughters one apiece of her first 5 babies. He had heard of black children being security for loans, of creditors claiming them while they were yet in their mother's belly, of debtors selling them in advance to raise cash. At that time in the Spotsylvania County seat slave auctions, he knew the average price that was being asked and paid for a healthy black baby past 6 months of age, when it was assumed then that it would live, was around $200. None of this was very far from his mind when Bel laughingly told him one evening in the cabin about 3 months later that during the day the inquisitive Missy Ann had demanded to know why Bel's belly was growing so big. "I told Missy Ann, I got a little biscuit in the oven, honey." Kunta was hardly able to keep Bel from seeing his anger at the attention and affection she lavished on that pampered, doll-like child, who was to him but another in the seemingly endless parade of little Missies and little Massas he had seen at so many big houses. Now with Bel about to have a child of her own, and his own, it incensed him to think about the firstborn son of Kunta and Bel Kinty romping in play with Two-Bob children who would grow up to become their Massas, and sometimes even the fathers of their own children. And Kunta had been to more than a few plantations where one of the slave children was almost the same color as his Massas. In fact, they often looked like twins, because both of them had the same white father. Before Kunta let anything like that happen to Bel, he vowed that he would kill the Massa rather than become one of those men he had seen holding their wife's high-yaller baby, and living somehow with the knowledge that if he uttered publicly so much as a complaining word, he would certainly get beaten, if not worse. Kunta thought about how high-yaller slave girls brought high prices at the county seat slave auctions. He had seen them being sold, and he had heard many times about the purposes for which they were bought, and he thought of the many stories he had heard about high-yaller man-children, about how they were likely to get mysteriously taken away as babies, never to be seen again, because of the white fear that otherwise they might grow up into white-looking men and escape to where they weren't known and mix the blackness in their blood with that of white women. Every time Kunta thought about any aspect of blood mixing, he would thank Allah that he and Belle could share the comfort of knowing that whatever otherwise might prove to be his will, their man-child was going to be black. It was early one night in September of 1790 when the labor pains began to take hold of Belle, but she wouldn't yet let Kunta go for the Massa, who had said that he would personally attend her, with Sister Mandy to be in readiness as his assistant if he should need her. Each time the pains came, Belle lay on the bed gritting her teeth to keep from crying out, and she would tighten her grip on Kunta's hand with the strength of a man. It was during one of the brief intervals between the pains that Belle turned her sweating face to Kunta and said, "It's something I oughta told you for now. I's already done had 2 chillins, long time ago, 'fore I ever come here, 'fore I was 16 years old." Kunta stood looking down at the anguished Belle, astounded. Had he known this? No, he would have married her anyway, but he felt betrayed that she hadn't told him before. Making herself gasp out the words between contractions, Belle told him about the 2 daughters from whom she had been sold away. "Just nothin' but babies is all they was." She began to weep. "One was just startin' to walk good, and the other and weren't a year old hardly." She started to go on, but a spasm of pain clamped her mouth shut and tightened her grip on his hand. When it finally subsided, her grip didn't loosen. She looked up at him through her tears and, reading his racing thoughts, said, "Case you wonderin', their daddy weren't no massa or no overseer. Was a field 'bout my age. We didn't know no better." The pains came again, much sooner than before, and her nails dug into his palm as her mouth opened wide in a soundless scream. Kunta rushed from the cabin down to Sister Mandy's hut, where he banged the door and called to her hoarsely, then ran on as fast as he could go to the big house. His knocking and calling finally brought Massa Waller, who needed but one glance at Kunta to say, "I'll be right there." Hearing Belle's anguished moans rise into shrieks that went ripping through the quiet of Slave Row pushed from Kunta's mind any thought of what Belle had revealed to him. As much as he wanted to be by Belle's side, he was glad Sister Mandy had ordered him outside, where he squatted at the door trying to imagine what must be going on inside. He had never learned much about childbirth in Africa, since that was considered women's affair, but he had heard that a woman birthed a child while kneeling over cloths spread on the floor, then sat in a pan of water to clean away the blood, and he wondered if that's what was happening now. It occurred to Kunta that far away in Jafur, Binta and Amara were becoming grandparents, and it saddened him to know not only that they would never see his man-child, or he them, but also that they would never know how he'd had one. Hearing the first sharp cries of another voice, Kunta sprang upright. A few minutes later, the Massa emerged looking haggard. "She had a hard time. She's 43 years old," he said to Kunta, "but she'll be fine in a couple of days." The Massa gestured toward the cabin door. "Give Mandy a little while to clean up. Then you go on in there and see your baby girl." "A girl child!" Kunta was still struggling to compose himself when Sister Mandy appeared at the doorway, smiling and beckoning him inside. Creeping through the front room, he pushed aside the curtain at the bedroom door, and there they were. As he moved quietly to her side, a floorboard squeaked, and Belle opened her eyes, managing a weak smile. Absently, he found her hand and squeezed, but he scarcely felt it, for he couldn't stop staring at the face of the infant who lay beside her. It was almost as black as his, and the features were unmistakably Mandinka. Though it was a girl child, which must be the will of Allah, it was none the less a child, and he felt a deep pride and serenity in the knowledge that the blood of the Kintis, which had coursed down through the centuries like a mighty river, would continue to flow for still another generation. Kunta's next thoughts, standing there at the bedside, were of a fitting name for his child, though he knew enough not to ask the Massa for 8 days off from work to spend deciding on it, as a new father would in Africa. He knew that the matter would require long and serious reflection, for he knew that what a child was called would really influence the kind of person he or she became. Then it flashed into his mind that whatever name he gave her, she would be also called by the last name of the Massa. The thought was so infuriating that Kunta vowed before Allah that this girl child would grow up knowing her own true name. Abruptly, without a word, he turned and left. With the sky just beginning to show the traces of early dawn, he went outside and started walking down along the fence row, where he and Belle had shared their courtship. He had to think, remembering what she had told him about her life's greatest grief, having been sold away from her 2 infant girl children. He searched his mind for a name, some Mandinka word, that would have as its meaning Belle's deepest wish never to suffer such a loss again, a name that would protect its owner from ever losing her. Suddenly he had it. Turning the word over and over in his mind, he resisted the temptation to speak it aloud, even just for himself, for that would have been improper. Yes, that had to be it. Exhilarated with his good luck in such a short while, Kunta hurried back along the fence row to the cabin. But when he told Belle that he was prepared for his child to be named, she protested far more strongly than he would have thought her capable of in her condition. "What's sich a rush to name her? Name her what? We ain't talked about no name nohow." Kunta knew well how stubborn Belle could be once she got her back up. So there was anguish as well as anger in his voice as he searched for the right words to explain that there were certain traditions that must be honored, certain procedures that must be followed in the naming of a child. Chief among them was the selection of that name by the father alone, who was permitted to tell no one what it was until he had revealed it to the child, and that this was only right. He went on to say that haste was essential, lest their child hear first some name that the Massa might decide upon for her. "Now I sees," said Belle. "These Africanisms you so full of ain't gon' do nothing but make trouble, and they ain't gon' be none of them heathen ways. And names, neither, for this child." In a fury, Kunta stormed out of the cabin, and nearly bumped into Aunt Suki and Sister Mandy on their way in with armloads of towels and steaming pots of water. "'Gratulations, Brer Toby. We comin' to look in on Belle." But Kunta scarcely grunted at them as he passed. A field hand named Cato was headed out to ring the first bell of the morning, signaling the others out of their cabins for buckets of water from the well to wash up with before breakfast. Kunta quickly turned off Slave Row to take the back path that led to the barn, wanting as much distance as he could get between him and those heathen blacks, whom the Toubab had trained to shrink away in fear from anything smacking of the Africa that had been their very source place. In the sanctuary of the barn, Kunta angrily fed, watered, and then rubbed down the horses. When he knew that it was time for the Massa to have his breakfast, he took the long way around again on his way to the big house kitchen door, where he asked Aunt Suki, who was filling in for Belle, if the Massa was going to need the buggy. Refusing to speak or even turn around, she shook her head and left the room without even offering him any food. Limping back to the barn, Kunta wondered what Belle had told Aunt Suki and Sister Mandy for them to go gossiping through Slave Row. Then he told himself that he couldn't care less. He had to do something with himself. He couldn't just idle away more hours around the barn. Moving outside with the buggy harnesses, he set about his familiar task of killing time by oiling them unnecessarily, as he had just done only 2 weeks before. He wanted to go back to the cabin to see the baby, and even Belle, but anger rose every time he thought of what a disgrace it was that the wife of a Kinty could want her child to bear some two-bob name, which would be nothing but the first step toward a lifetime of self-contempt. About noontime, Kunta saw Aunt Suki taking in to Belle a pot of some food, some kind of soup, probably. It made him hungry to think about it. A few minutes later he went out behind the barn where some recently harvested sweet potatoes had been mounded under straw for curing, picked out 4 of the smaller ones, and, feeling very sorry for himself, ate them raw to appease his stomach. Dusk was descending before he could bring himself to go home. When he opened the front door and walked in, there was no sound of response from Belle in the bedroom. She could be asleep, he thought, leaning over to light a candle on the table. "That you?" He could detect no special harshness in Belle's tone. Grunting non-committally, he picked up the candle, pushed aside the curtain, and went into the bedroom. In the ruddy glow, he could see that the expression on her face was as adamant as his own. "Look-a-here, Kunta," she said, wasting no time getting to the point. "It's some things I knows 'bout our massa better'n you does. You get him mad with that African stuff, he sell us all 3 at the next county seat auction just so's we born." Containing the anger within him as well as he could, Kunta stumbled for the words that could make Belle understand the absoluteness of his determination that whatever the risks, his child would bear no two-bob name, and that moreover she would be given her name in the proper manner. As deeply as Belle disapproved, she was even more apprehensive of what Kunta might do if she refused. So with deep misgivings, she finally acquiesced. "What kind of voodoo you gotta do?" she asked dubiously. When he said he was simply going to take the baby outdoors for a while, she insisted that he wait until the child awakened and she had nursed her, so that she wouldn't be hungry and crying, and Kunta immediately agreed. Belle reckoned that the baby wouldn't wake up for at least another 2 hours, by which time it would be most unlikely that anyone in Slave Row would still be up to see whatever mumbo-jumbo Kunta was going to perform. Though she didn't show it, Belle was still angry that Kunta prevented her from helping him pick a name for the daughter she had just brought into the world amid such agony, and she dreaded finding out what African-sounding, forbidden name Kunta had come up with. But she was sure that she could deal with the baby's name later in her own way. It was near midnight when Kunta emerged from the cabin, carrying his firstborn wrapped snugly in a blanket. He walked until he felt they were far enough from Slave Row that it couldn't cast a pall over what was about to take place. Then, under the moon and the stars, Kunta raised the baby upward, turning the blanketed bundle in his hand so that the baby's right ear touched against his lips, and then slowly and distinctly, in Mandinka, he whispered 3 times into the tiny ear, "Your name is Kizzy. Your name is Kizzy. Your name is Kizzy." It was done, as it had been done with all of the Kinty ancestors, as it had been done with himself, as it would have been done with this infant had she been born in her ancestral homeland. She had become the first person to know who she was. Kunta felt Africa pumping in his veins, and flowing from him into the child, the flesh of him and Belle, as he walked on a little farther. Then again he stopped, and lifting a small corner of the blanket he bared the infant's small black face to the heavens, and this time he spoke aloud to her in Mandinka, "Behold, the only thing greater than yourself." When Kunta returned with the baby to the cabin, Belle all but snatched her away, her face tight with fear and resentment as she opened the blanket and examined her from head to toe, not knowing what she was looking for, and hoping she wouldn't find it. Satisfied that he hadn't done anything unspeakable, at least nothing that showed, she put the baby to bed, came back into the front room, sat down in the chair across from him, folded her hands carefully in her lap, and asked, "All right, let me have it." "Have what?" "The name, African, what you call her." "Kizzy." "Kizzy! Ain't nobody never heard no name like dat." Quinta explained that in Mandinka, Kizzy means you sit down or you stay put, which in turn meant that unlike Belle's previous 2 babies, this child would never get sold away. She refused to be placated. "Just start troubles," she insisted. But when she felt Kunta's anger starting to rise again, she thought it would be wise to relent. She said she seemed to recall her mother speaking of a grandmother whose name was Kibby, which sounded very much the same. At least that's what they could tell the massa if he got suspicious. The next morning, Belle did her best to hide her nervousness when the massa came to look in on her, even forcing herself to laugh good-naturedly as she told him the baby's name. He only commented that it was an odd name, but he said nothing against it, and Belle breathed a heavy sigh of relief the moment he stepped out the door. Back in the big house, before leaving for a day of visiting his patients with Kunta driving him, Massa Waller opened the large black Bible that he kept locked in a case in the drawing-room, turned to a page devoted to plantation records, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and wrote in fine black script, "Kizzy Waller, born September 12th, 1790.